Language is important to storytellers for obvious reasons. And at the time of recording this story, there are things in the news that make me think that people, particularly people in power, are not being very careful about how they use language. So this is a story about language based upon the 1697 collection by Charles Perrault. So it's a French fairy tale called Snakes and Pearls, and this is how I will tell it to you. Once upon a time, there was a family of 2 girls, stepsisters, and they were cared for by their mother and stepmother. Well, when I say cared for, one of them was cared for. The natural daughter of the woman was cared for by her. She was the mother to the daughter, and she loved her daughter and she spoiled her daughter. But her stepdaughter, she treated her like a servant. She had to do the worst jobs. She had to do all the gardening. She had to do all the cleaning. She had to clean out the toilet. She had to do everything. But the worst job she had was to go and fetch water from the well. Because, of course, in these days there was no water on tap. You had to go to the well to go and get water. And the well was near the end of the world. And so the stepdaughter one day set off with a bucket to go to the well at the end of the world to get water for her stepmother. And she walked all that way, mile after mile, until she came to the well at the end of the world. But she didn't get water. Well, not immediately, because what she saw at the well at the end of the world made her pause, made her stop. It was an old woman sitting next to the well, panting for breath, tired and dirty, wearing dishevelled clothes, torn and old. And the stepdaughter looked at her and said, "Mother," because that's what you call a woman you respect, "Mother, are you well? Is there anything I can do for you?" And the old woman said, "Oh, child, I have walked such a long way. I'm tired and thirsty and dirty, and please could you get some water for me?" And the stepdaughter said, "Of course I can." And so she lowered her bucket into the well and pulled it up and gave the old woman water. She didn't think about her own task, her own job of collecting water, until she had made sure that the old woman had had enough to drink, that she'd had water to wash her face and her hands, and that she was sitting somewhere in the shade. And only then, when she had a bucket of water for her own task, did the stepdaughter leave the old woman and head for home. And as she headed for home, she looked over her shoulder and waved goodbye to the old woman, and the old woman waved goodbye to her and said after her, "You will receive your reward." The stepdaughter arrived home, obviously a lot later than she was expected, because she'd spent all that time looking after the old woman, and her stepmother said to her, "Where have you been?" And her stepsister said to her, "Where have you been? Where have you been?" And she said, I've been at the well, but there was this old She stopped, because as she has said the words, "I went to the well, but I stopped because of the old from her lips fell pearls, which dropped onto the ground in front of her. Her stepmother looked at the pearls on the ground and said, "Where did they come from?" And her stepsister said, "Where did they come from? Where did they come from?" And she said, "I don't know." But as soon as she opened her mouth to say the words, "I don't know," and with every syllable she pronounced, from her lips fell diamonds, rubies, emeralds. With every word she uttered, from her lips fell precious stones and pearls until there was a pile on the ground. And when she'd finished telling her story, her stepmother said, "That old woman, she had to be a fairy. Well, you're not the only one who can get diamonds and pearls and rubies and emeralds. Daughter," she said to her natural child, "daughter, tomorrow you go to the well and you help the fairy, and then you will speak with diamonds and rubies and pearls." And her daughter said, "Oh, mother, that's so unfair. Why should I have to go to the well?" But her mother said, "You will go to the well and not argue." So the next day, it was the daughter who went to the well with the bucket, And she had to go miles and miles and miles, but she did not do it with good grace, as she stomped her way towards the well at the end of the world. And when she arrived there, sitting by the well, was nobody. No old woman to look after and give water to. So the girl sat down and waited, and waited, and waited until she heard the sound of horses' hooves. Now, an old lady is not going to make the sound of horses' hooves. It wasn't the old lady, it was a horse. It was a beautiful white horse, and riding the white horse was a beautiful woman, dressed in silk of silver and gold, and hanging from the horse's bridle were bells. So along with the sound of the hooves came the tinkling sound of silver bells. And the beautiful woman rode her horse up to the girl sitting by the well at the end of the world. And the beautiful woman looked down and said, "My dear, I'm quite thirsty. Could you get me some water from the well, please?" And the girl looked up at her and said, "Why? Why should I? Why can't you get off your horse and get water for yourself? Didn't you bring a bucket?" And the woman looked rather surprised and said, "No, sadly, I didn't bring a bucket with me when I came riding this morning. But you appear to have a bucket. Could you not get me some water?" And so the girl got some water. Not a bucket full, but just a little drip at the bottom of it. And she handed the bucket to the beautiful woman and said, "There! And I hope I get my reward." And the woman wet her lips with the water from the bucket, and she handed it back to the girl and said, "Oh yes, you will get your reward." And she rode off. Well, the sun started to set and there was still no sign of the old lady, and so the girl decided it was time to go home. So she set off for home. She didn't even bother to take the bucket with her. When she arrived home, it was already dark. And her mother said to her, "Where have you been?" And she said to her mother, "Don't talk to me about it." But as she said the words, "Don't talk to me about it," from her lips fell frogs that then jumped around the floor. From her lips fell snakes that slithered around the floor, and with every syllable she spoke, from her lips fell snakes and frogs and slugs and lizards. Her mother screamed. "Where did they come from?" she said, and her daughter said, "I don't know," but as she spoke, more disgusting creatures fell from her lips. And they realized the beautiful woman on the horse, she was the same fairy, and now the girl was cursed. And I'd like to tell you that there was a happy ending for her, but there wasn't, because her mother shut her in the shed and never wanted to see her again, and fed her from underneath the door of the shed. And all she could hear any time her daughter shouted at her was the sound of disgusting creatures hitting the ground in the shed. And as for her stepdaughter, she threw her out of the house. Yes, there were diamonds and pearls falling from her lips and forming little pools of precious stones on the ground, but she had enough. She didn't need her stepdaughter anymore, so she threw her out onto the street. And so the stepdaughter walked along the road, homeless, and the tears fell from her eyes. And as she walked with her head hung low, staring at the ground, she heard the sound of horses' hooves. And she turned around to look, and there was not a great white horse. This time it was a black stallion, and riding the black stallion was a handsome prince who saw the girl crying, and for some reason, who knows why, he stopped and said, "Why are you crying?" And she told him her story. And her words were so gentle that he jumped down from his horse to listen to her. Her story was so sad, he sat on the grass next to her and listened to her. And her story was spoken with such gentle words that it was as if, as she spoke, diamonds and rubies were falling from her lips. And so he lifted her onto his horse, with her consent, obviously, and they rode off together. And for once, in one of the stories that I like to tell, I believe they really did live happily ever after. And that is the story of Snakes and Pearls, and that's how I have told it to you.